Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli here. Welcome to a brand new In the Shop, and I've got a great one for you today, and a timely topic to add to that. Today's shop, we're going to be talking about pre-spawn cranking. Pre-spawn cranking. Cranking for bass that are moving from their winter habitat toward their spawning ground. You know, pre-spawn is one of the best times of the year, not only to catch numbers, but to catch big ones. This is the time of the year where the females show up. They're full of eggs, they're full of roe, and they're feeding to fatten up before the spawn. When I think of pre-spawn, I'm thinking of water that's still cold, but warming. And that's a big part to this movement that we're going to talk about. And whenever you mention movement, fish that are moving toward something, fish that are moving toward their spawning habitat, fish that are moving love a moving bait, right? A crankbait. And the other great thing about that is you have to cover water to find them in the pre-spawn. So because of all those reasons, crankbait is one of my favorite baits ever. But we're going to get really specific in this video. We're going to dial it in to 3 of my favorite crankbaits. We're going to dial in the zone that I like to target, the depth zone that I like to target. We're going to even talk about where to find these fish as they make that movement, right? As they make that pre-spawn migration toward those spawning areas. So we have a lot to cover. Let's get started. First thing is depth zone. And with crankbaits, you've got crankbaits that run a foot all the way to 20, 25 feet, right? You can fish a crankbait in a lot of different depth zones. But in that pre-spawn period, I'm really going to focus in on this range. And that range, you ready for this? 2 to 6 feet. 2 to 6 feet. Here's the thing. I know what you're saying. You're thinking right now, 2 to 6 foot. That's you know, what does that mean? I don't care if you live in the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, the West Coast. This range, this 2 to 6 foot range, is a sliding depth. It's a depth that fish use as they're sliding and feeding, right? Sliding and feeding. Remember, that fish that's moving from their winter spot toward the spawning areas, they're eating. It's been a long, cold winter. It's been very frigid for them. The feeding opportunities have been sparse. But as it's warming, those fish are sliding, and that 2 to 6 foot zone is unbelievable. When we're talking about water temperature, that's going to have a little range to it depending on where you live. In this pre-spawn period, in a lot of parts of the world, we're talking about a water temperature that's still cold, but warming. We're talking about water that's in the mid 40s to low 50s. But in those warmer climates, it's going to be a little warmer than that. We're talking water that's that 50 to 56, 57 degree range, right? So low to mid 50s. So range could be from the low 40s all the way to the mid 50s, depending on where you live. But that 2 to 4 foot zone is key. And because of that, my crankbait selection really shrinks in the pre-spawn. And these are my 3 favorite. Without a doubt, these are my 3 favorite. And I'm going to start with these 2 because they fill the biggest niche for my pre-spawn crankbait fishing. First one, the DT6. The DT6. And when I want to hit that 6 foot mark on the deeper range of these sliding fish, that 6, 7 foot range, you can even get this a little deeper, the DT6 is perfect. I love the DT6 because it's a balsa bait. It's got a very, very minimalistic rattle, just a little knock to it. It's balsa. and it's a slow rise bait, which I want when that water's cold. So when I'm pre-spawn cranking and I want to get it down into that 5 to 7 foot range, that 6 foot mark, DT6. Next one is a really great crankbait designed by Ott Defoe for Rapala. It's called the OG Slim. And this crankbait's a little bit more of a true flat side crankbait, has a circuit board lip. But this is the crankbait I'm going to use when I want to hit that 2 to 4 foot zone, right? So a little bit on the shallower scale of this range, this pre-spawn range we're talking about, I'm going to use that OG Slim. It's definitely going to hit that 2, 3, 4 foot mark. It's going to be banging around the bottom. We're going to talk about that more in a second. But just like the DT, the OG Slim is balsa. It's got a tight wobble, and it's got a slow rise to it on the pause. All things we want when that water is still cold, right? This is pre-spawn cranking, right? This isn't summertime cranking. It isn't fall cranking. Pre-spawn cranking. Last but not least, and I always have this in the mix, is a Shad Rap. In particular, a size 5 or a size 7 Shad Rap, and especially the 5. And I always have this in this pre-spawn mix, not just because these Shad Raps 5 and 7 hit that 2 to 6 foot, which they do, not because of that, but because it's a finesse crankbait. And this is my choice over the DT and the OG Slim when things are tough. Good examples of when I go to a Shad Rap versus the DT or the Slim would be ultra clean water in this pre-spawn period, when that water is crystal clear. If a major cold front hits, a lot of times I go to the Shad Rap 5 or 7 versus those other two. And last but not least, if I'm out there, I'm pre-spawn cranking, 2 to 6 foot zone, and there's a lot of anglers out there. There's a lot of fishing pressure, right? I get into an area of the lake, the fish are there, but there's boats everywhere. A great alternative to those bigger plugs is a Shad Rap, okay? So pre-spawn conditions, pre-spawn conditions, 2 to 6 foot, colder water, sliding fish. We're going to talk about that next. I want one of those 3 crankbaits. DT6, OG Slim, Shad Rap, all balsa baits, all very tight wobbles, and all with a slow rise. Very, very key in that cold water, okay? All right, let's talk a little bit now about where I'm going to fish these baits, And this is a topic that seems confusing, but when you sort of play connect the dots, it becomes a lot easier. And the banks I'm targeting, now remember, I'm going to keep saying it over and over, pre-spawn fish are sliding fish. They're moving fish. They're transient fish. And because of that, I'm looking for sliding banks. Banks where they're going to move toward their spawning areas. And the easiest way to find these spots, okay, is to look at a map. Look at a map that has contours, right? Look at a map that has topographical information on the map. So old school paper maps, digital maps, on your phone, on your tablet, or even just go to your sonar unit and pull up your mapping. Pull up your Lowrance Sea Maps or your Navionics, your Lake Masters. Pull up those maps to see the contours. And the areas that I'm trying to target, the areas that I want to fish, these 3 crankbaits in the pre-spawn in that 2 to 4 foot zone are sliding banks that are between where they wintered and where they're going to spawn. When you know where they wintered and where they're headed to spawn, finding these banks becomes easy. I am telling you, it becomes easy. So I'll give you the gist of it, the real quick version of how to find it. So wintering fish, right? We're pre-spawn now. The water's starting to warm. Wintering fish, though, they spend their time in the deepest, most vertical break areas in that part of the lake that you're fishing, right? So when I'm looking at that map, I'm looking at main lake areas that have a steep drop. Talking about vertical style banks. Give you a couple examples of that. It would be main lake points that have deep water nearby, mouth of a creek where there's a channel swing right up to the bank, super deep vertical water is a great example. In smaller lakes or ponds, the area near the dam that has the deepest water would be a good example. So I'm identifying wintering areas based on deep vertical breaks. Then I want to go ahead and flash forward now to the spawn and where these fish are going to spawn. And when I think about that, I want shallow, protected flats, right? I want shallow, protected water. That's the kind of places they're going to spawn, right? That's the kind of places they're moving to. So I circle wintering areas in my mind, deep vertical breaks, more main lake. Then I'm looking ahead to the spawn, and I'm circling or I'm imagining where these fish are going to spawn. So now I'm looking at creeks. I'm looking at coves and pockets, especially creeks, coves, and pockets that are on the north or northwest side of the lake, north or northwest banks. They're the ones that heat up the first. And I'm looking for that flatter water, right? That more horizontal, flat, shallow water. And I circle that. I just make a mental note of that. So I have wintering, I have spawning, and literally, guys and girls, literally, I just connect the dots. I get a pen or I get my cursor on my waypoint screen, my GPS screen, and I look at banks that they have to slide down, right? They have to travel down these banks. And most of these banks are going to have a 45-degree taper to them, right? Not vertical like they want in the winter, but these banks are going to have a more 45-degree taper to them, right? And these are the banks that they're sliding down to get to the spawning places, pockets, coves, creeks, right? And so once I know those banks, that's where this thing really comes into play because I can cover so much water. I'm targeting that drop-off on these connecting banks. A lot of times they're secondary points. A lot of times they're the sides of the points. Not the point itself, but the side of the point that has more of that 45-degree taper. And I'm targeting, I'm going to say it again, you ready? 2 to 6 foot zone in the pre-spawn. The interesting thing about those tapering banks connecting the vertical deep to the shallow flat is somewhere on that bank, you're going to have some form of cover. The great thing about this pre-spawn period is they'll stop and use lots of different types of cover. On some lakes, you're going to have new grass growth on these banks. You're going to have hydrilla. You're going to have milfoil. You're going to have some sort of vegetation. On other lakes, you're going to have rock. And they love rock in the pre-spawn, especially because it warms a little faster, right? Gravel, chunk rock, boulders, any of that, hard scrabble, any of that rock really attracts the heat. So there's going to be rock on these transition banks. And when I'm looking at rock, I really look for banks that have rock mix to something else, okay? The great thing about it is you can use your eyes for a lot of this. When you're on the water, your depth finder is great, but if you look at the bank, what you see out of the water generally transitions to in the water. So I'm looking at these banks, right? the banks between wintering and spawning. I'm cranking down them 2 to 6 foot, and I'm looking, and I'm targeting any kind of cover that's on those banks. Grass, rock, where rock mixes with, where rock starts and gravel ends, where mud starts and rock mixes in, those transition areas, and any kind of cover, right? So wood, laydowns, brush, cover along these transition banks. All right, last but not least, how I'm going to fish this crankbait in the pre-spawn period. Really, really important piece of this. And if you've listened to some of the other shops, you know my rule on crankbait fishing. 90% of the time, I need that crankbait to hit something and deflect. 90% of the time, for me to get that bite with a crankbait, especially in the pre-spawn period, I need that crankbait to hit off of something. So as I'm fishing down these transition banks, remember, crankbaits cover ton of water. It's great. I'm trying to get that crankbait to hit along my retreat, to hit the bottom, 2 to 6 foot to hit the bottom. The great thing about these baits, they've got bills. That bill is going to help that bait dive down. There's an OG Slim in the smaller size. And that bill is going to let me hit that cover, grass, rock, wood, whatever it is, and deflect it. And a lot of my bites are going to come that way. But here's something important. As you fish down those transition banks from winter to spawn, as you're looking for those fish that are moving, right? They're moving, they're sliding, they stop and feed on cover, then they keep moving. As you're looking for those areas, I want to quarter cast that break, right? Remember, most of these banks are going to have that little taper to them, and I don't want to parallel the bank. I don't want to parallel that drop, right? I don't want that crankbait running down the drop. I don't want to cast deep on that drop to where that thing's never going to hit. 90% of my bites are going to come when it hits. So I want to quarter cast from shallow to deep. So all that means, quarter casting these 3 crankbaits, all that means is I'm setting my boat up so that the first part of my cast is hitting shallow, 1 to 2, 3 feet. As I reel it in, the crankbait continues to dive. It goes down that 45 bank, hitting as it goes down, as it gets to 4, 5, 6, and then the crankbait's under the boat, 7, 8 foot. Now it's not hitting anymore. I make my next cast. I'm quarter casting that drop off. That is so key because without quarter casting, you're not going to get this crankbait to deflect. That 2 to 6 foot zone, you want it to touch, right? So casting, purposely hitting the bottom, purposely getting it to touch that cover. When I'm reeling that bait, I make that quarter cast to the bank. I'm reeling it. I feel it hitting the whole way. A lot of times when I feel it bump something hard, something very distinctive, right? I'm reeling, I can feel it kind of touching. Then all of a sudden, it makes a big hit. I stop it. And remember what we said about these crankbaits. Slow rise. So when that DT6 gets to 5 foot and it hits off that lone stump on this bank that goes from winter to spawning, 45-degree angle, when it hits that lone stump and I'm cranking it, I stop. And I let it rise for about 2 seconds. I count 1, 2. And that slow rise of all 3 of these plugs, which are balsa, triggers that bite. They see it deflect. He's there. He comes up, eats it, and you got him. So key in the pre-spawn period. Listen to me, man. If you're anywhere in the country fishing in this time frame, right? In a lot of parts of the country, we're talking about March to April. And a lot of parts of the country, we're talking about water that's low 40s to low 50s. Or if you're in the South, low 50s to mid 50s. If you're fishing in these pre-spawn conditions, try one of these crankbaits, 2 to 6 foot, deflect it, quarter cast a 45-degree transition bank, and you're going to get a lot more bites. Man, I hope you enjoyed this one, talking about pre-spawn cranking, one of my favorite techniques. If you like what you're hearing, do me a favor, stop right now and subscribe to my channel. That button's right down there. Hit that subscribe button. If you're already subscribed, tell your fishing friends about Mike Iaconelli Fishing on YouTube. We got great new content coming every single week. By the way, if you look down in the links down there, we're going to have all the tackle in the description and the links. So check that stuff out if you want to get a hold of it, and I hope you enjoyed it. Cold water pre-spawn fishing, crankbait fishing, nothing beats it. Bye.